Alright, I am back with another video, and today we are doing, I guess it's a build request. Someone over on the Discord basically asked, hey, how would I make a John Wick build? And I was like, actually, I've been meaning to make a kind of gun fu master build for a while. And initially that's kind of what I lent more into, kind of making someone who is kind of like that action movie, like fighting style kind of thing, like for John Wick films or like certain certain action films where like they're like fighting each other in close quarters combat, but there's also guns being fired off at the same time. But then I kind of led more into the John Wick inspiration, since I am quite a fan of the movies. I've seen all of them. I just like kind of mindless action like that. That's just me. And so I kind of lent more into it, and the build changed slightly from the Gun Fu Master into the Baba Yaga, which I know in D&D there is an actual Baba Yaga and it's a totally different thing, but because of how pop culture works, Baba Yaga is actually more commonly associated with John Wick as a franchise now. So I've decided to go with it. And honestly, I'm quite happy with how this build turned out. It's very powerful. It kind of fits the themes that I was going for, and overall it will be fun to play. It's fairly simple to play, there's not too much to it. Makes some cool uses of like different kind of style combinations, especially with the fact that we're using ranged weapons on a monk, which is always nice. I've technically already done a build like this before a long time ago. It was a very let's just say unknown video of mine. A very few people actually saw it, but I did do a build request double feature a long time ago where I built Nightcrawler from X-Men and Vaj the Stampede from Trigun, and that was kind of like a gun fu build for Trigun 1. So this I kind of brought some ideas over from that, but this is mostly mostly a new build. There's some changes. The kind of like ideas I kind of went for with this character, again taking from the John Wick inspiration, is why don't we just straight up make like fantasy John Wick, right? Let's say that this specific version of Mr. Wick was a citizen of Baldur's Gate, and he lived, with his wife and all that. Obviously his wife died tragically, and then we have the dog, which for those of you who have seen the movie did not go well. But I think in this case, I don't think it would be the wife just passing away. I actually think that they would have been gotten by a ball list. Not just any ball list, though. The Dark Urge themselves, the Ball Spawn. Because, for those of you that don't know, if you don't play as the Dark Urge, you can actually find them dead at the beginning of the game. And my kind of headcanon for this is that John, in this case, was hunting down the Dark Urge, the Ball Spawn that killed his wife. Because we're not playing as the Dark Urge. This is the guy that we sent to kill the Dark Urge. Oh, that's the tagline. That's the tagline. That's going on the thumbnail. So this guy is meant to be a purely unstoppable force, using both guns, or in our case crossbows, and hand-to-hand combat to absolutely shred through any ball list in their way. Because doing the Dark Urge in wasn't enough, especially since that kind of got taken away from him with the whole Nautiloid incident. The Dark Urge died from the crash, not by his own hands, so he's going to go after all of them. The Ball Spawn have to die, and anyone related to them or that gets in his way will die too. This will include the Cult of the Absolute, and by extension Orin and Gortash, who was aligned with her, all of this sort of thing. This character has a definite reason to go after the big three of the endgame, and again, just the kind of idea of making this ranged character that is this unstoppable force of pure kind of rage and malice just felt so fun. So I really do hope you enjoy this one. Let's get into the build. As you may have guessed, we are going to be starting with Barbarian. Barbarian is going to give us access to the weapon proficiencies that we need, as well as access to unarmored defense as well. We are going to be getting unarmored defense in multiple different forms, and for the most part we will actually be using the wisdom unarmored defense, because of course this build is taking monk levels, but for now I think it'll work out quite nicely. Rage is also nice, as it is going to add extra damage to our unarmed strikes. Although, there is a weird bug with that, and I'll get to that later. Next up, for the background, I've gone for Soldier, giving us Athletics and Intimidation. In my mind, this is the closest thing to Assassin that we're going to get, or like kind of Hitman type deal. Athletics is nice because it's going to help patch up some of those like strength checks, and Intimidation makes perfect sense for this build because, well, I think this character is going to be pretty intimidating. Next up, the ability scores, which yes, are going to look a bit weird, but do hear me out on this one. I kind of wanted a little bit of everything with this build, or at least as much as I could get. We wanted a lot of different stats here, so I kind of picked up what I thought worked. Dex strength is at 14, which is a bit of a weird one because you don't really need it since we're going to be using dexterity for our, attack and damage rolls. But I did decide to boost it up to 14 here because it helps with like pushing, athletics checks, and stuff like that, and it makes sense to have a bit of strength in here, but feel free to change this up however you like. I kind of needed to like put things in what the hell was that? Something just walked past the screen. Anyway, I did kind of need to put points into like other stats as well, and I did end up having to use the Gloves of Dexterity for this build to kind of make it all work anyway. So I had extra points lying around, and I thought, you know what, let's put it in Strength. This can allow you to, if you feel like maybe not taking an ability score improvement later, you could get the potion of Everlasting Vigor to bump this up to 16, and then pick up Tavern Brawler to deal even more damage on unarmed strikes. But that's up to you. There's a bit of variance here. You can take the points out of Strength and put them into Charisma or Intelligence if you like. It's entirely up to you. Dexterity, as I said, is at 8. Unfortunately, with the way this build worked with its stat spread, 18 would have been the highest we could get anyway, and since I tried to keep this character actually kind of low magic, like the idea of this character in a world of fantasy where magic and, people who can explode things with their mind exist, the fact that this guy just trundles forth on pure combat skill alone, no magic whatsoever, kind of felt right to me. So, well, I say no magic whatsoever, obviously there's a little bit of fantastical elements in every class, but the fact that I kind of wanted to go with like a low magic kind of character, so I didn't really want to pick up like gloves and such that like boosted like our damage with like fire or force or something like that. I know there is damage boosting gloves that like do regular damage anyway, but again, we weren't going to be able to get higher than 18 dexterity on this build, and our other stats were going to take a hit, so to do that, so it made sense to just use the Gloves of Dexterity, set our dexterity to 18, and then have a more well-rounded character, which I think is going to work out better in the long run. Constitution is at 16. We are actually going to be a tank with this build, so having a high amount of Constitution to give us better HP is nice. Intelligence is at 8. It's the only stat that I didn't think we really needed, but again, if you feel like you don't care about the strength aspect of things, you can take a few points out of strength and put it into intelligence. Obviously that leaves us with an odd score, unfortunately, but again, you can try and make that work if you like. Perhaps you could drop this down here, this down there, and if you decide to get Tavern Brawler later, bump it up to 12 and get a little bit of a stat boost. It's up to you. Do whatever you like with that. Next up, as I said, intelligence is at 8, because it's the only one we don't really need, but I could absolutely see points going into this, like I just said, if you want to make intelligence checks. Wisdom is at 16. It is going to be one of our most important stats. Wisdom is great for saving throws anyway, especially against being charmed and or frightened, because we don't want to be charmed or frightened, because we can't. We are, again, this unstoppable force. We don't want to be frightened, so things like wisdom do actually help with that, and again, it's going to affect things like our overall damage output, as well as our AC in the late game as well. And finally, Charisma is at 12. I wanted a little bit of Charisma so we could have slightly better intimidation checks, and wouldn't be completely useless if we had to be the party face, which again, if you're playing as this character as your Tav, then you most likely will be anyway, so having a 12 in Charisma is nice. As for our ability scores, you can kind of have whatever you like here. Athletics and Intimidation come from our background, as I already said, which is perfect. We were going to probably pick those up anyway. We are a human, so we can pick up any proficiency you like, so it's free for you to choose. I went with Sleight of Hand just because that kind of made sense for me. Kind of breaking into places so you can kill people does make sense. I went with Animal Handling here because, again, John kind of has a thing for dogs. Not like that. God damn it. He likes dogs, so I thought Animal Handling would make sense, but actually you can take this off, as we are going to be getting Speak with Animals later. So feel free to put this into whatever you choose out of this. Survival would make sense. In fact, I guess survival would probably be the only other one to pick, because I don't think nature would really work. So survival or animal handling, your choice. I'll go with animal handling for now, as we're not going to be getting Speak of Animals until quite a bit later, but of course you can always respec if you want. Okay. Now, next up, we're going to jump straight over to Monk. We don't necessarily need anything else from Barbarian just yet, and I'd rather get the actual foo part of the gun foo, so let's grab it. We're going to be picking up Flurry of Blows. You already know how this works. It says it's not doing much damage, but that's because we don't have the Gloves of Dexterity on yet. So, but, you know, Flurry of Blows as a bonus action attack, it's very, very powerful, one of the most powerful kind of abilities in the game, in my opinion, especially if you build it right. We're also going to get Unarmored Defense using our Wisdom. On dexterous attacks, boosting up, allowing us to use dexterity instead of strength, which isn't going to matter to us unless we do use a melee weapon, which there will be an option, but I'll get to that later. We are on Armor Strikes now. Do a deal. Oh, I can't speak today. Our Unarmed Strikes deal 1d4 bludgeoning damage instead of just our strength modifier, which is great. And we now can make a bonus attack as an unarmed strike. With a unarmed strike after making an unarmed strike or attacking with a monk weapon. Unfortunately, our ranged crossbows aren't going to be considered monk weapons. Only melee weapons can be considered monk weapons. So if we want to get this feature, we are going to have to attack in a different way. But most of the time, you will use Flurry of Blows anyway. So it's not a huge deal. Also, I learned recently, because I'm actually going to be playing D&D 5e soon, for real, I didn't realize monks just didn't get this bonus unarmed strike. It comes from, like, certain subclasses, which is weird. I think that should just be a thing that they have. Regardless, let's keep going. At Monk level 2, we're going to get improved unarmored movement, allowing us to get a bit more movement speed. We're also going to get Patient Defense, Step of the Wind Dash, and Step of the Wind Disengage. Again, I don't usually care for Dash and Disengage, but Patient Defense is actually really nice for this build. It's going to enable some strategies that we'll be able to get into later. Patient Defense allows attack rolls against you to have disadvantage, and gives you advantage on dex saves, just making you a little bit more tanky overall. Combining this with Barbarian makes you able to sponge a lot of damage. At Monk level 3, we do get to choose our subclass, and while Way of Shadow can work, giving you stealthy capabilities and like things like Darkness, so if you wanted to do some Eversight Ring shenanigans you could. Again, I wanted to keep this character low magic, so of course we're going with Way of the Open Hand. Way of the Open Hand is going to give us multiple different martial arts techniques. Again, John Wick is a master of things like Krav Maga, Karate, Kung Fu, he can do it all, so he has a lot at his disposal, and as such has developed techniques to be able to kind of make his opponents do what they want to do. In our case, topple, stagger, and push. Now, if you wanted to drop the Barbarian levels and kind of do something similar to my Wandering Swordmaster, you could get a Battle Master Fighter as well instead, which would allow you to kind of get like special gun attacks as well as a few other things, but I felt like I kind of wanted to do something different for this build, and I think you'll see the vision when we get to the end. But for now, our kind of special martial arts attacks coming from our Flurry of Blows options, I think it's good enough for me for now. At level 4, we are going to get to choose or level 5, I apologise, we are going to get to choose our first feat. Now, you can kind of select these in any order you like, but you know we're going to be getting both of these in order to make this playstyle work. I would personally recommend picking up Crossbow Expert first, although we are going to be grabbing Sharpshooter later. Crossbow Expert is going to make this full playstyle come online, allowing us to make crossbow attacks while in melee range without disadvantage, and Piercing Shot also inflicts gaping wounds for twice as long, basically giving us a way to make our enemies bleed, a point-blank shot. This is basically going to enable the full playstyle, like I said, allowing us to shoot and attack with our monk actions while in melee without having to worry about where we're placed in combat. So overall, I feel like this works out pretty nicely for us. Again, you could take Sharpshooter first, but the playstyle that we're going for here is going to feel a little bit more awkward, and we have less ways to mitigate Sharpshooter's penalty this early in the game, so I feel like it does make sense to take Crossbow Expert first. At Monk level 5, we're going to be getting extra attack, meaning now we can shoot or punch twice per turn of our action, in addition to our bonus action attacks. We're also going to get Stunning Strike, which makes perfect sense, allowing us to punch an enemy's vital, causing them to be stunned, meaning that they cannot move or take reactions, or bonus actions, which is nice. A very John Wick action movie move, for sure. At Open Hand Monk level 6, we're going to be getting all the kind of main features that we want here. Our movement speed is now increased to 4.5 meters rather than 3. Our unarmed strikes count as magical for the purpose of overcoming enemies' resistances and immunities to non-magical damage, which is great. as well as we now get the ability to use the manifestation abilities to add either radiant, psychic, or necrotic damage to our unarmed strikes, equal to 1d4 plus our wisdom modifier. I would say you're probably going to be using psychic most of the time because, again, Mr. Wick is very intimidating. He often has his enemies quaking in their boots before he even arrives, so dealing psychic damage just by hitting them makes a ton of sense. But in the cases of enemies that are resistant to psychic damage or straight up immune to it, like the Steel Watchers that I usually test on, Radiant or Necrotic will also work. We're also going to get Wholeness of Body, allow us to give ourselves a little bit of healing, where we enter a temporary state of wholeness, and we also gain an extra bonus action. This is the part of the movie where John gets beaten pretty hard, and he's, like, knocked to the floor, but then he just spits out the blood, gets back up, and goes even harder. Yeah, that's literally this in a nutshell. A bit of healing, an extra bonus action to do more Flurry of Blows and bonus action attacks for 3 turns. Absolutely perfect. I kind of wanted this build, again, in typical John Wick fashion, to be a tank, to be able to just take a lot of hits and keep getting back up and kick even more ass. That's the whole point, because John Wick basically gets beaten and bruised on an inhuman level. He's thrown downstairs, hit by cars, shot, cut, everything, and yet somehow, in superhuman fashion, he continues to move forward. Despite the fact that John is actually just a regular human, in terms of D&D, he has very high stats all across the board. Reminds me of an anime character in a way, in that sense. But yeah, level 6, we're really getting what we want. At Monk level 7, we're going to get a few other things that are going to really help us out. We're going to get Evasion, allowing us to, whenever a spell or effect would deal half damage on a successful dex save, it deals no damage if you succeed and only half damage if you fail, making us an even more effective tank. We're also going to get Stillness of Mind, meaning that if we are charmed or frightened, we automatically remove the condition. Again, unfortunately this does cost an action for us, but again, I would say this is less of John just, like, kind of like being frightened for a second. I would say this is basically like you just kind of take a hit and then just shake yourself, like shake your kind of head to like get rid of it and then get straight back into the fight. The fact that it takes our action sucks, but we do have a high wisdom score, so the chances of this happening are lower anyway. But even if it does, we are never frightened or charmed. We are straight as an arrow, true to our mission of vengeance. And now you have a choice. We're going to do Monk level 8. And obviously we're going to be picking up Sharpshooter, so I kind of jumped the gun a bit there. Let's talk about Sharpshooter. Your ranged weapon attacks do not receive penalty from high ground rules. Great. Ranged weapon attacks with their weapons, you are proficient with, have a -5 penalty to their attack roll, but deal an additional 10 damage. We will have plenty of ways to kind of mitigate that penalty, as you will see. This is just basically a pure damage boost. But let's get into the next big thing. At this point you have a choice. You can go to level 9 of Open Hand Monk. This will give you an extra key point, even more unarmored movement, meaning that difficult terrain no longer slows you down and you can jump even further. You would also gain the key resonance abilities, but I feel like this isn't really on theme for Wick. And yes, this would give us the biggest damage die for our unarmed strikes, a D8. However, I don't think it's necessary. Our unarmed strikes, even at level 8, are going to do more than enough damage anyway, especially if we rage, because 1d6 plus 2 is basically a 1d8 in a way, so it's not a huge deal. I'm going to suggest we go back to Barbarian for the rest of our levels, because if we go to 4 levels of Barbarian, we get an extra feat. And in a build where we're taking 2 feats rather than ability score improvements, I think it makes sense to get all the stat boosts we can get. So, level 2 of Barbarian is going to give us Danger Sense, meaning that we have advantage on dex saves against traps, spells, and surfaces. And also Reckless Attack, giving us advantage on all attack rolls, but enemies have to also have advantage against us. Now, originally I just thought, perfect, a pretty not so resource intensive way to get advantage on our attacks to offset Sharpshooter. I did not know you have to have a melee weapon equipped in order for this to work. So if you want to go for pure unarmed strikes and guns alone, you're not going to be able to really use this feature. I didn't use this feature in my testing, but I was still able to land most of my shots anyway, so it's not a huge deal. But if you wanted to use this feature, you will have to have a melee weapon equipped. So you could go for something like the Knife of the Undermountain King, or a dagger, or something like that. Anything you like. I mean, John Wick has fought with swords and knives before, so it totally makes sense, and you will be able to use this feature. And I will be showing off a melee weapon option that I think would work quite nicely for this build in a minute anyway. But for now, Reckless Attack is an option. You do just have to have a melee weapon equipped, which means you can't use your unarmed strike. as an action. However, as long as you're using a finesse weapon or a non-two-handed weapon, you will still be able to use that as a monk weapon to get your bonus action attacks. So it's not a huge deal, but I just thought it's something I should point out. At Barbarian level 3, we do get to pick our subclass, and, well, we're going to be going with Wildheart. Wildheart is going to give us a bunch of things that I think would be nice for this build. We get to speak with animals, like I alluded to earlier, meaning that now we can talk to our dog, and of course, Scratch is now mandatory for this build. We also do gain another rage charge, which is nice, and we do get a decent buff to our HP because Barbarian is quite bulky. And now we do get to choose a Bestial Heart, and I do think Bear makes the most sense. Bear is going to give us resistance to all damage except Psychic, meaning that we are going to be extremely tanky, again leading into the that idea that the inhumane, like almost superhuman-like amount of damage we take and keep going makes a bit more sense and can be reflected in the build a bit better with resistance to everything. Now, I will point out there is currently a bug in the game. For some reason, the base rage, the basic rage, or the frenzy from Frenzy Barbarian applies the +2 damage to unarmed strikes. Wildheart rages, though, don't for some reason. Definitely a bug, needs to be fixed. So technically our unarmed strikes are taking a slight dip when we use this, but I think the tankiness that we get in return is absolutely worth it. But if you're not too into that, you can go for Berserker to gain an enraged throw and a frenzied strike. If you want to, you maybe use a melee weapon a bit more. It's entirely up to you. But I really like Wildheart for the tankiness, and as you can see, it is very effective when we see the combat footage, which technically you would have already seen. And finally, we do get another feat at the final level here, because we went to level 4, and I'm going to pick up an ability score improvement and bump up our wisdom to 18. This is just going to give us a lot more power overall. And that is the build. Overall, what you're getting out of this is an unstoppable force. You're effective, and I mean extremely effective, at both melee and range, able to combine the two into a really unique playstyle. Being able to combine crossbows with melee combat and punches is just such a fun and visually interesting style. You gain all of the different ways to mess with your opponents through Flurry of Blows. You can be very defensive using things like Patient Defense. You can heal yourself using Unrelenting Ferocity from Barbarian and Wholeness of Body from Monk. Stunning Strike is great. Reckless Attack can help with Sharpshooter if you've got that melee weapon equipped. As you can see, there it is. And Rage just makes us an unstoppable tank. We truly are the Baba Yaga with this build. But let's get into what really makes it the equipment. Now, there's a lot of variance to this build. As you can see, I have a ton of weapons here. We know we're going to be wanting to use a crossbow, but which crossbow exactly? Well, let's have a look. The one I have equipped here is just a basic hand crossbow +2. If you're looking to basically have the you know, kind of like low magic kind of deal, then this is the best thing for you. It's just a +2 hand crossbow, works a bit like John's iconic pistol being a one-handed weapon. Despite it doing only a d6 of damage compared to a heavy crossbow's d10, this is still going to do a lot of damage for you, but of course, feel free to use a heavy crossbow if you so choose. So let's look at the rest of the potential weapon options. Keeping on the idea of hand crossbows, there's the classic near misser, which would allow you to use force damage, which could be useful in certain situations where piercing isn't really going to work. There's also the Hellfire hand crossbow, which is about the same as the regular hand crossbow +2, but it's got a bit more magic influence, allowing you to inflict burning and cast Scorching Ray. Feel free to change these two up as you like. You can dual wield with this build, but we didn't pick up 2-weapon fighting from any particular source, as again, this was more intended to be a one-handed, or like the kind of like more like a pistol build rather than a dual wielding build, so it won't be as effective. And you're mainly going to be using your bonus action for like monk stuff anyway, so it didn't really feel necessary. So if you want to be as on theme as possible, go for a single hand crossbow. Otherwise, you can dual wield or go for a heavy crossbow, which I will kind of show your options now. Herald is a early game crossbow that whenever you deal damage to a target with a ranged weapon, it must exceed a charisma saving throw or be baned for 2 turns, basically meaning that they have a penalty to attack rolls and saving throws, which is nice. There's also the Fabricated Arbalest, giving you Illuminating Shot as a bonus action. Now you can shoot with your bonus action as well. That inflicts Radiating Orb, making you a bit harder to hit, and can use a weaker version of Sunbeam called Dazzling Ray that can blind enemies. We also have the Giant Breaker. I believe this is one of the earliest ones weapons you can get as a decent crossbow option for us. Your weapon hits so hard that your target is sent reeling for 2 turns, meaning that they have a penalty for 2 attack rolls for every turn remaining. And finally, the Hellfire Engine crossbow, a +2 heavy crossbow with lightning arrow once per long rest as a kind of special power shot, and the ability to use the reposition malefactor to be able to pull enemies towards you or pull allies to safety. Overall, you have a very decent, can I click off of this? Thank you. We have a very decent set of ranged weapons here, all of which it would make sense to use. I would say probably the one you want to go for earliest is Giant Breaker, and the fact that so many of these weapons basically reduce our chances to be hit by affecting enemies' attack rolls, we're always going to be very hard to hit, which is actually going to synergize with this playstyle, as we'll get to in a minute. But finally, if you wanted that melee weapon option, a nice Act 3 option, which is late in the game, but I think would actually work really nicely for this build, is Rhapsody, giving you a +1 bonus to attack rolls, damage, and spell save DC for every foe we kill, up to 3 turns. So our little murder spree is going to add up into a pretty significant buff really quickly, helping to offset the Sharpshooter penalty as well as adding to our damage. We also can possibly inflict bleeding while hitting a creature with this weapon while hiding or invisible. I decided to not really focus on like stealthy aspects with this build, otherwise I probably would have gone with Shadow Monk, but you can see here how well this kind of works for this build. Of course, there are plenty of other options. Like I say, an early game option would be the Knife of the Undermountain King, which would be amazing because it would make our critical hits easier to land, and it would also re-roll the damage die when it's low. So I feel like that would be a great early game option, but then you can swap to this if you so choose later, and of course having this enables reckless attack for us as well. For the rest of the build, let's get into the equipment. We have the Mask of Soul Perception as always. Whenever I'm running a Sharpshooter build, this is usually my go-to option, giving us a +2 bonus to attack rolls, initiative rolls, and perception checks. Again, helping us offset the Sharpshooter penalty and allowing us to move first in combat, getting those first few shots off, taking out 1 or 2 enemies before getting into the nitty-gritty combat. But there are other options here. As an earlier game option, the Marksmanship hat gives you a +1 to your ranged attack rolls, helping to offset that Sharpshooter penalty a little bit, but I feel like with the leveling scheme of this build, by the time you get Sharpshooter, you probably already have the Mask of Soul Perception, so it's not a huge deal. But then again, we also have the Bone Spike Helmet. This does kind of a slightly different thing for us, but it is still kind of cool. When you rage, hostile creatures within a 3-meter radius must succeed a wisdom save or take psychic damage. Again, kind of inflicting that fear of the myth of the Baba Yaga, right? And it also gives us a +2 to our intimidation, and if we are using a melee weapon, we gain access to menacing attack, dealing a little bit of extra damage, and can possibly frighten enemies. Again, the legend of the Baba Yaga instilling that fear is just really, really cool. We do lose the added bonus to our attack rolls, unfortunately, which does mean that we will have a bit more trouble with Sharpshooter, but it's a kind of give and take thing. What do you want out of this build? More, pick your poison. Next up for our armor, I've gone for the Vest of Soul Rejuvenation. Whenever we succeed a saving throw against a spell, which we'll be able to do quite a lot, we will regain a little bit of HP, and whenever someone misses us with a melee attack, if they are within range, we can spend our reaction to attack them with an unarmed strike. So, you know, again, those scenes in action movies where, like, you know, the guy will punch and then, you know, the main character's head will dodge to the side and then they immediately counterattack. That is this in ability form. Again, being able to weaponize our reaction as well in a way that makes sense for a build like this. Again, that close quarters gun-fu type of fighting. I really, really like this one. It feels perfect for this build, and it also gives us a +2 to armor class, giving us a pretty solid 20 armor class when all is said and done. Next up, we have the Gloves of Dexterity, as I already said, setting our Dexterity to 18, as well as giving us a +1 bonus to our attack rolls, helping that little bit more with Sharpshooter. And finally, the Boots of Uninhibited Kashigo. When the wearer deals additional damage equal to their Wisdom modifier with unarmed strikes, just making our punches that much more powerful. As you can see here, our main kind of hand crossbow here does about 7 to 15 damage, although it's not taking into account the Sharpshooter benefit right now for some reason. Why is that? I don't know. I'll just quickly activate the manifestation passive as well. But in combat, you can see that that will be like a +16, so it does do way more damage, as well as our kind of flurry of blows, as you can see, also does a lot of damage. So we're going to be doing a lot of damage all over the place with both our unarmed strikes and our weapon damage, which is nice. But of course, these are kind of late game options, the armor and the boots. So for the armor, you could pick up the Enraging Heart Garb, giving you a +2 to your Constitution for a bit, which would make you a bit more tanky. And in the early game, you can also pick up the boots of speed, allowing you to dash as a bonus action and have disadvantage on opportunity attacks against you. This is basically a way just to maneuver around the map in the early game, be a bit quicker without having to spend your ki, which is really nice. And then next up, the accessories. Of course, as always, I've got the Sentient Amulet here, because this is really the only one that kind of worked for us. We're mainly here for the Ki Restoration feature. I don't care for Shatter in this build, allowing us to gain a little bit more Ki points per long rest, which is nice. However, I would definitely say when you're in the endgame, swap this out for the Amulet of Greater Health. That would allow Barbarian's Constitution based on armored defense to take over, giving us even more defense, AC at 22, even more HP, taking us up to 145, and advantage on Constitution saving throws, meaning that we are going to be pretty much unstoppable at that point. Slight spoilers here, you can enter the House of Hope and pick this up without alerting the house's owner, and leave and play the rest of the act. As soon as you start Act 3, you can go and get this, and then leave, and then come back to do the rest of the area later. So that's kind of how this works. You can pick this up pretty early on if you know what to do. Just make sure you disarm the traps first. I think this would work great for this build, and it also means that you can dump Constitution to maybe put points into something else instead, like Intelligence and Charisma and Strength, making it so that you have a few more options as far as that's concerned. Maybe then you could pick up Tavern Brawler and just make this build even more powerful. It's entirely up to you. Next up is the Ring of Free Action, allowing us to ignore the effects of difficult terrain and cannot be paralyzed or restrained. Again, we are that unstoppable force. Since we didn't take level 9 of Monk, we still get that kind of feature anyway through this ring, which is nice. And then finally, we have the Shadow Cloaked Ring, allowing us to deal an additional 1d4 damage with weapon and unarmed attacks against lightly or heavily obscured creatures and creatures made of shadow. Fun fact, Sharpshooter adds a +10 to the damage of this ring's ability as well, technically allowing you to do a bit more damage. Not sure if that's a bug or not, but as long as they're kind of in the shade, you will be able to do that extra bit of damage with all of your attacks. As for the outfit that you can see here, this is camp clothing. This is what the build looks like normally. Yeah, I know. So I've gone with camp clothing here. Unfortunately, this particular camp clothing is modded using the Harlequin black and white dye. This is from the Citizens Clothing camp clothing kind of mod, which looks quite nice for John in my opinion, but there are some camp clothing items that can work for this build if you decide to go that route. I'll have a link to one particular option in the description below. But yeah, that is the build. Overall, like I said, it's just a really, really effective tank, being able to use those resistances to take a ton of damage and keep fighting. Sharpshooter is going to allow you to do a massive amount of damage with your crossbow attacks, both at range and melee, and your unarmed strikes are just going to deal a boatload of damage anyway, because we're playing an open-hand monk, and that's kind of their deal. I mean, you can see in the combat footage, I decided to just use my regular combat kind of scenario to test, and they just got destroyed. I mean, this build is just powerful. Too powerful. There are some situations where you might lose the kind of like, you might have a bit of a harder time making a shot because you are threatened, but if you use Flurry of Blows to push an enemy away, you can negate that entirely. You'll see there's a few strategies kind of laid out throughout this combat footage. Yeah, I mean, there's not much else to talk about this build. It is fairly simple. It was fun to kind of make this build based on, like, kind of one of my favorite movie characters. So, yeah, I mean, I'm glad somebody requested this build because I was quite happy to do it. I am going to end this video here. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all next time.